Hello, my name is Margaret, and I just turned 71. On my 70th birthday, my daughter gave me a gift I'll never forget. She left me alone in a snowstorm with no phone, no money, and no way home. They thought I wouldn't survive, but they didn't know I'd find a diary, hidden fragile, and written by someone betrayed just like me. And that little book. It helped me tear their perfect plan apart. At 70, I've learned that silence makes the perfect wrapping paper for betrayal. Margaret Whitaker stood at the window of her cabin, one hand resting lightly on the sill, the other wrapped around a porcelain teacup that still held its heat. Outside, the early January snow had begun to fall, again thin, fluttering flakes that seemed less like weather and more like punctuation in the quiet rhythm of her mourning. The voicemail still echoed faintly in her memory, a message left the night before by her daughter. "We've got something special planned. You won't be alone this year." The words had arrived with the softness of a kiss, and yet there was something about Vanessa's tone that didn't settle quite right. Too light, too rehearsed. Still, Margaret had smiled then, as she did now, because hope had a stubborn root in her. She moved carefully through the kitchen, placing 2 slices of rye bread into the toaster, her motions deliberate. The house creaked, as it always did in winter, the old wood contracting beneath the snow's hush. On the table, she laid out a single plate, a napkin folded into a triangle, a butter knife, and a jar of blackberry jam she'd made last summer. She poured tea from the blue kettle, her husband's favourite, and reached instinctively for the worn scarf he'd left behind. It was draped over the back of his chair, just as she always left it. She pressed it to her chest and closed her eyes. There were birthdays that danced vividly in her mind, the one where Edward had surprised her with a cake shaped like a stack of books, candles flickering above titles they both loved. The year Vanessa had made her a collage from paper scraps and glue sticking on bits of lace and ribbon. Those memories clung like the scarf's wool to her skin, comforting, scratchy, stubbornly warm. A sharp knock interrupted her reverie. She opened the door to find Daniel, her son-in-law, standing there in a charcoal coat, shoulders dusted with snow keys, jangling in one hand. He smiled, but not the kind that reached the eyes. "Vanessa wanted me to pick you up," he said, voice bright but tight. "We're taking you to a quiet little place. Secluded. Peaceful." Margaret's gaze flicked past him toward the white SUV idling at the edge of the drive exhaust, blooming like breath in the cold air. Her lips parted to ask something. Where is Vanessa? Why not just tell me the name of the place? But the questions dissolved. She looked down at her slippers, then at the scarf still clutched in her hand. With practiced grace, she nodded. "Let me just lock up," she said. Inside, she moved more slowly. The toast had popped forgotten. The tea was cooling in its cup. She turned off the kettle, unplugged the toaster. Her hand lingered over the photo on the mantel, Edward young and full of mischief, one arm around her shoulder. "I'll be back soon," she whispered. The cabin, as if in reply, said nothing. The road curved deeper into the trees. And with every turn, something in me grew colder than the snow. Margaret sat quietly in the back seat, the scarf still knotted loosely around her neck. The window beside her had frosted into pale fern patterns. Each curve of the road erased what was behind. Snow flurried harder now, brushing sideways across the windshield, like whispers trying to be heard. Vanessa, seated beside her, reached over and patted Margaret's gloved hand. "You'll love it, Mum. It's peaceful, like one of those artist retreats you used to read about." Margaret smiled faintly, though her gaze didn't leave the passing trees. They were deeper into the forest than she remembered any neighborhood being. Pine trunks loomed tall and still. No mailboxes, no fences, only miles of white hush and bark. Daniel said nothing. His hands were steady on the steering wheel, his jaw set. The GPS had been turned off at least 10 minutes ago, Margaret noticed. In the pocket of her mind, a memory bloomed the winter of 79. She and Edward had taken a wrong turn near Glacier Park. The snow had been knee-deep, their laughter breathless. They were lost, but never alone. Edward had hummed to calm her, pressing her hand between his. That warmth had lasted decades. This didn't feel the same. The SUV turned off the paved road onto a narrow path barely cleared of snow. The tires crackled as they pushed forward into silence. There was no signage, no cabins, just one trail leading deeper into whiteness. Daniel slowed the car, then parked beside a small clearing lined with skeletal trees and stone benches buried in snow. "Just the last leg of the trip," Vanessa said cheerfully. "The car can't go further in this terrain." Margaret looked at her daughter. "Walk where to?" "It's just a little spot." Vanessa smiled. "Quiet. You'll like it." Daniel opened the back door, took her elbow gently. Margaret stepped out. The air was sharp and thick with stillness. Only their boots disturbed the powdery surface. The forest around them stood like watchers, silent and tall. They walked together, Margaret in the middle, Daniel slightly ahead, Vanessa lingering behind. After about 300 feet, they reached a snow-covered stone bench facing a clearing. There was no house, no gate, just trees, silence, and snow. "Just rest here a bit," Vanessa said, brushing snow from the bench. She touched her mother's shoulder. "We'll be right back. Just going to grab a few things from the car." Margaret sat down slowly. The bench was cold, even through her coat. She looked up to speak, but her daughter had already turned. Daniel's figure was moving quickly back through the path, shoulders hunched. She watched them vanish into the trees. Then came the engine. It cracked the silence like a splinter of glass. The SUV roared alive. Tires spun, snow burst outward, and then the sound grew smaller, swallowed by the forest. No one returned. Margaret remained seated, hands folded in her lap. Her breath formed tiny clouds, each one thinner than the last. She did not shout, did not rise. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket. Her fingers searched, then stopped. No phone. She checked the other pocket. No wallet. She stood slowly scanning the path they had come from. Nothing but the hush of trees and the steady falling snow. Her voice was barely a breath when it came. "They left me. The cold didn't scare me as much as the quiet, until I heard the hinge of a door creak." Margaret staggered through the knee-high snow, the scarf wrapped tighter now, not for warmth, but for memory. Her breath came in small, uneven clouds. Each step was a prayer whispered in motion. The forest pressed inward, like a crowd holding its breath. She recalled something Edward used to say when they hiked the old northern trails together. "If you ever get lost, trust where the moss grows. It points north." Her eyes scanned the trunks. Moss clung stubbornly to the northern faces, guiding her however dimly through the haze of cold. Branches clawed at her coat. Snow crept into her boots. Then ahead, a break in the trees. Not a clearing, but a shadow carved into the white, a crooked cabin, half swallowed by roots and snowdrift. Its roof slanted under age, and one shutter dangled loose like a broken arm. The door sagged on its hinges, slightly ajar. She hesitated. The silence here was thicker, heavier, as if waiting. Margaret pushed forward and placed her hand on the wood. With a brittle groan, the door gave way. She stumbled inside. The air held the stale scent of old paper and forgotten seasons. Dust motes shimmered in what little light trickled through a cracked window pane. The wind banged the door behind her with a soft thud, sealing her inside. She blinked. In the far corner was a wooden trunk, carved, battered, its latch rusted but loose. She knelt with care, breath shallow, and lifted the lid. Inside lay a folded quilt, 3 stubby candles, and a leather-bound notebook worn at the edges. She reached for it. The cover bore no name. But when she opened it, the first page read, "To the woman who was once trusted, so was I." Her hands trembled, but she kept reading. "My name is Abigail Moore. I write this not for company, but for legacy. I was left here once abandoned, in the name of love, betrayed in the name of care. My daughter and her husband said they were taking me to rest. I see now what that meant." Margaret sat on the floor, snow melting into a pool beneath her boots. Her heartbeat was no longer numb. It pounded now with recognition, with disbelief. She turned the page and another. "I was once a librarian, a mother, a friend, until I became a burden wrapped in aging skin." It was as if the journal were reading her aloud. The wind howled outside, a long wail that faded into hush. Then further down the worn page, there is a lawyer, a code, and a truth buried in snow. Margaret looked up, the candlelight flickering from the pages onto the walls. She was not alone. Not anymore. Her handwriting was steady, even as everything in her life was being stolen. The wind whispered against the cracked window, a faint hum that barely disturbed the hush inside the cabin. Margaret sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, the quilt wrapped loosely around her shoulders. The fire in the small iron stove snapped now and then, throwing dancing shadows across the walls. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't cruel. The journal rested on her knees. Its cover had softened in her hands. She turned the page. March 3rd, 2018. She brought the documents in a folder, said they were simple, said it was just to keep things running smoothly. I asked no questions. I wanted her to feel I trusted her. I suppose I did in a way, not in the papers, but in the child I once held. Margaret's fingers hovered over the ink. Her thoughts drifted to a memory Vanessa last spring, smiling as she handed her a cup of chamomile tea. "You don't have to worry about these things anymore, Mom. Let me handle the taxes this year. It's safer if I manage this for you." Margaret had nodded, grateful. The paperwork overwhelmed her since Edward died. Vanessa had always been so articulate, so polished. Her daughter could read contracts like recipes, quickly, confidently. Margaret had signed. Back in the cabin, her thumb brushed a smear on the old page. Abigail's ink had bled slightly there, as if pressed by an unsure hand. She said I was tired, said I'd earned the right to rest. All I had to do was trust. Outside, the snow began again, light at first, then heavier, brushing the roof like soft hands with cold intentions. Margaret lit one of the stubby candles beside her. The flame flickered into a steady glow, casting a warm cone of light onto the journal. She turned another page. I wasn't foolish. I saw the pattern. It was love that kept me silent, not ignorance. I thought maybe if I stayed gentle, they would stay kind. Margaret exhaled sharply through her nose. She thought of the time Daniel offered to fix the online banking for her, of Vanessa's voice on speakerphone saying, "It's too confusing for you, Mom. Let us help." She thought of the moments she hesitated but smiled anyway, the times she felt the shift in tone but ignored it because love, after all, had its quiet compromises. But now, reading Abigail's words, something within her cracked, not loud, but lasting. There was a new entry dated months later. "They think I've forgotten, but I made copies. I have a lawyer. And there is one they don't know about. It's not for revenge. It's for dignity. It's for remembering who I was before I became a burden." Margaret closed the journal gently and looked toward the window. The snow had thickened. The world beyond the glass was white, opaque, unforgiving. She spoke to the silence, her voice barely rising. What if, what if this was never a gift, and the quiet this time did not answer back? If you find this, you were never meant to stay forgotten. Margaret held the journal as if it were a pulse, something alive, something guiding. The candle had burned low through the night, its wax hardened into a crooked trail down the saucer. Dawn now seeped through the cracks in the wooden cabin walls, pale and grey, like breath held too long. The snow outside had softened. Meltwater dripped from the corners of the roof with irregular rhythm. She sat wrapped in Edward's scarf, the journal folded into the fabric like a secret passed through time. She didn't shiver. Not from cold, at least. Carefully, she turned toward the back of the journal. Its spine creaked, resisting as if protecting what lay inside. Tucked between the final pages was a photograph, creased, fading edges, curled like dried petals. 3 figures stood close together in the frame. One was unmistakably Abigail Thinner, younger, but her eyes just as watchful. Beside her stood a girl, no more than 10, with a wide smile and an oversized coat. And the third was a man in a sweater vest holding a stack of papers. His glasses caught the light obscuring his eyes. Below the photo, in looping script, Abigail had written, Gaines. Trustworthy. Code 7229A. Margaret traced the name with her thumb. Gaines. A name, yes. But more than that, a door perhaps barely ajar. She remembered something Vanessa sitting across the kitchen table 2 years ago, casually sipping coffee. We had to update the deed, Mum. That old paperwork wasn't even digital. It's safer this way. I took care of it. At the time, Margaret had nodded. She'd been tired. Tired of legalese, of deadlines, of calling hotlines that put her on hold for 40 minutes just to be told her questions weren't in the system. She hadn't asked what the new deed said, hadn't thought to. But now a whisper inside her stirred. She flipped the final page. Abigail's handwriting trembled, the ink slightly faded. If my granddaughter ever finds this, tell her I still remember her laughter. She laughed like birds in summer before they taught her to be ashamed of my wrinkles. Margaret closed the book slowly. She sat in silence. Not the stunned silence of betrayal, but the watchful quiet of someone beginning to see the outline of a puzzle's last piece. She folded the photo into her coat pocket, and tucked the journal beneath the quilt inside her knapsack. It was time to move. But then, just as she stepped toward the door, a crunch in the snow. She froze. Another sound. Then a voice. Tentative, lifted by the wind. Hello, anyone inside Margaret held her breath. The past had spoken. Now someone living was calling through the storm. My name is Lena Moore. I think you're holding my grandmother's story. Margaret blinked against the light as the cabin door eased open. The young woman standing in the frame had dark curls escaping her wool cap, her breath coming out in careful puffs. Her voice was soft, unsure, but her eyes were steady. Margaret didn't move. Her fingers still gripped the edge of the table resting beside the journal. I was surveying the northern ridge, the girl continued, stepping inside. Snow delayed me yesterday. This cabin isn't even on the new maps. She paused, then nodded toward the journal in Margaret's lap. That belonged to Abigail Moore, didn't it? Margaret studied her. The girl crossed the floor, slowly. She didn't sit. She didn't presume. Her eyes scanned the space, the single chair, the fading heat from the stove, the worn quilt. Then she looked at the book, and her breath caught. Margaret held it up. I found it here. She wrote it. For someone? Maybe for you. The girl knelt, ungloved one hand, and touched the edge of the page. My grandmother died before I could ask questions. But I remember her voice. And this, she pointed to a line on the open page, this is how she signed her grocery lists. I know that curl in her M. Margaret motioned gently toward the second stool. They sat in silence for a moment, broken only by the hiss of a log shifting in the hearth. I'm Margaret, she said, voice rough with exhaustion. I'm Lena. Abigail was my father's mother. But they didn't speak much about her after she went into assisted living. They said she was confused, that she made things up. Margaret gave a small, bitter smile. Yes, that's what they say, when the truth doesn't suit them. Lena reached into her coat and pulled out a small thermos. It's just chamomile, but it's warm. They drank together, steam curling between them. Margaret, in fragments, recounted the drive, the clearing, the goodbye wrapped as a gift. She didn't dramatize it, just told the parts that mattered. Lena listened, really listened. No interruptions, no furrowed brows. Just steady presence? Finally, Margaret asked, Do you know the name Gaines? Lena nodded slowly. Jeremiah Gaines. My grandmother mentioned him once in a letter I found after she passed. He works with Legal Advocacy Elder Protection. Still does. I volunteer for a non-profit that partners with his group. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. The world had shifted under her again, but this time it tilted towards steadiness. Lena spoke gently. Let me take you down the mountain. You need rest. And Gaines? He's not far from here. I'll help you get in touch. Margaret looked at the journal, then at Lena. Only if we carry this with us? She said, drawing the book close, as though it might vanish in her absence. They packed in quiet rhythm, Margaret moving slower but with clarity. As they stepped beyond the porch and down the path of melting snow, Lena glanced sideways. Do you want to be silent? Or do you want to be heard? Margaret didn't answer. Not yet. But her steps found strength. The things they didn't shred might be the things that save me. The building looked plain, like a dentist's office that had long stopped pretending to be cheerful. Brown carpet-framed prints of local wildlife and a faint smell of dust and old toner. But inside its walls lived stories locked in file drawers and digital archives waiting for someone to say, Look again. Margaret sat beside Lena in the waiting area of the Elder Advocacy Resource Centre, her gloved hands resting on the satchel holding Abigail's journal. Outside, the January wind flurried across the parking lot, but in here, everything stood still. A young woman with a messy bun and thick glasses approached them. Ms. Whitaker, Lena said you had a file number. Margaret nodded, unfolding the crumpled note from her coat pocket. 729A. There may also be something under my full name, Margaret Elizabeth Whitaker. The woman's brows lifted. That's from the old case vault. I'll check both. They waited. Lena offered a mint. Margaret declined. 10 minutes later, the staffer returned with a tablet and a file folder. So, we do have entries under your name, she said, sliding into the seat across from them. There's a power of attorney submitted by Vanessa Whitaker Dresner in 2019. Digitally signed. Claims you gave her control of your financial matters. I never signed anything digital, Margaret said quietly. Well, the signature looks like a scanned copy, actually. Here, see for yourself. She turned the tablet toward them. Margaret leaned in. Her name was there, slanted and neat, but too neat. Off. Her W curled downward instead of up. And the date it was, from the week she'd been hospitalized for pneumonia. I don't remember this, she murmured. They often count on that, Lena whispered. The staffer scrolled further. Here's a financial profile update from March 2020. That's when your primary status on the shared account was changed. After that, most transactions were conducted by a secondary party, Vanessa. Margaret didn't speak. She stared at the digital form, at the typed lines and timestamps. They used my trust as ink, she finally said. But my memory is still the pen. Lena placed a hand gently on her arm. Let's keep going. The staffer tapped through another file. There's also a property transfer. Wait, this is recent. She clicked open a scanned contract. Margaret stiffened. There it was. Black and white. Her home, her name crossed out, replaced with Daniel Dresner's. The transfer date, January 7th, 2023. The same day they left her in the woods. Margaret's breath caught, but she didn't cry. Instead, she sat straighter. Lena leaned forward, voice tight. Do you see what I see? Margaret nodded slowly. They needed me gone to complete this, she said. Lena turned the screen toward her. This was signed the day they left you. I never thought the truth would live in the bottom drawer of a retired plumber's desk. The house hadn't changed. Same cracked sidewalk leading to the stoop. Same chipped gnome guarding the front door. Fred always joked it scared away political canvassers. Margaret knocked her breath, held not from fear, but from the heavy weight of memory. Lena stood a few feet behind her, not intruding, just present. The door creaked open. Fred squinted through thick bifocals, then smiled with one side of his mouth. Well, I'll be. Maggie Whitaker. I thought you'd gone to Florida, like the rest of the escapees. Margaret gave a ghost of a smile. Not quite Fred. May we come in? He moved slowly, but with a dignity that made Margaret slow her own steps in respect. The living room was cluttered with warmth, old magazines, framed fishing photos, a recliner with the stuffing half out. Lena remained near the doorway, letting Margaret lead. Fred motioned toward a kitchen chair. Sit, sit. Want tea? I think I've got some from 2008. No tea, thank you, Margaret said gently. I'm actually here about something you might have kept. A while back, 2019, maybe I gave you some of my documents to hold on to. After my pneumonia scare. Fred scratched his head. Right. You said the hospital lost your file once, and you didn't trust 'em not to lose something else. He shuffled toward a small writing desk near the wall. The bottom drawer stuck as always. He gave it a hip nudge, then pulled out a yellowed manila envelope. This it. The handwriting was hers. Margaret's fingers trembled as she opened the flap. Inside her original 2019 last will and testament, ink signed, notarized, with a note clipped to the front in her own cursive, in case of my absence, do not modify without presence of witness. Fred watched her face carefully. That important. It's everything she whispered. Fred shuffled back to his chair. Funny thing. Your daughter Vanessa, Wright, came by one day while you were in the hospital. Said you'd asked her to pick something up. She said you'd been forgetful lately. Margaret looked up sharp. What did she ask for? Said you left some financial records here. Asked if I had anything in your name. I said no. Didn't feel right. You didn't give her the envelope. Fred snorted. Didn't even tell her it existed. Lena smiled softly from the corner. Margaret looked again at the document. The seal, the ink, the date. This will was legitimate, unlike the revised one Daniel had produced, which had no notary, no witnesses. They hadn't expected her to remember or to return. Fred scratched his arm. Odd, though. They came back. 2 days after you disappeared. Margaret turned slowly. Hooted Fred's voice lowered. Vanessa and the husband drove up in that SUV. Said you'd gone on some long vacation. Didn't want to be bothered. Asked if I'd seen you. He looked directly at her now, eyes wet. I knew something was off, but I figured maybe I just didn't understand. Margaret reached across the table, touched his hand. You understood perfectly. Fred looked at Margaret and said, they came back 2 days after you disappeared. Said you were taking a long vacation. They didn't expect me to return. Not with receipts, not with memory. The porch creaked under Margaret's boots like it remembered her weight. It had been hers for nearly 30 years, this house with its cedar siding and stubborn front door. She used to plant chrysanthemums along the steps every fall. Now only frost remained brittle and silent. She reached for the doorbell but then knocked instead. Knocking felt more deliberate, more human. A shuffle inside. Then the click of the latch. Vanessa opened the door, her smile wilting before it fully bloomed. Her lips parted, but no words emerged. Margaret raised her hand in a small wave. Hello, dear. Mom, Vanessa finally whispered, her voice tight. What are you? We thought you were still at the center. I was, Margaret replied, brushing snow from her coat. It was quiet, restorative, but I missed my tea set. She stepped forward, waiting for Vanessa to move. The daughter blinked, then slowly opened the door wider. The house smelled different. Not bad, just unfamiliar. Citrus-scented candles and something lavender. Her paintings still hung in the hallway, but the family photos had been rearranged. Daniel appeared from the kitchen, a mug in hand. His smile twitched like a faulty light bulb. Margaret, we didn't know you were welcome back. I'm not staying long, she said, her voice calm. Just wanted to check in. Vanessa hovered near the mantel, arms crossed. We were going to call. Soon. Of course, Margaret said. Daniel cleared his throat. Tea. We just made a fresh pot. No, thank you. She moved toward the living room, her eyes scanning the space. Her blanket chest now held a vase. The books she'd alphabetized on the shelves were out of order. She sat slowly in her favorite chair, the one Daniel once called a relic. From her bag, she pulled a folded wool item, her husband's scarf. She laid it across the armrest, deliberate, silent. Daniel's eyes flicked toward it, then to Vanessa. So he said lightly, Are you feeling better? I wasn't unwell, Margaret replied, folding her hands. Just misplaced. Vanessa chuckled, nervous. It's so good to see you. We were really worried. Margaret looked at her, quiet, unblinking. Vanessa flinched first, shifting her gaze to the floor. Daniel sat on the edge of the sofa. You know, we were going through some of your financials, just to make sure things were in order. Retirement accounts, the deed, all that. If you need help sorting anything, I have everything I need, Margaret said, including my memory. Vanessa's hands clenched. Margaret leaned forward. Tell me, Vanessa, did you sign my name, or did you become me? Silence fell like snowfall, soundless but suffocating. Daniel stood quickly. I'll get more tea. No need, Margaret said, rising. She picked up her gloves. I'll be in town for a while. She looked back, once let her gaze linger on the hallway where her husband's coat once hung. No one said goodbye. As she stepped off the porch, she saw Lena waiting across the street. Margaret gave the faintest nod. Inside, through the front window, Daniel tapped his phone screen furiously, face pale, jaw tight. Daniel looked at Margaret, his face draining of colour, and discreetly typed something into his phone. They set the table like it was a welcome, but it felt like a trap lined with linen. The dining room hadn't changed, at least not in shape. The long oak table still held its minor scratch from a Thanksgiving long ago when Vanessa was 7 and dropped a carving fork. The chandelier hung above it like a frozen moment, but now it shone just a bit too bright. Everything gleamed too polished, too careful. Margaret stood at the entrance for a beat longer than necessary. "Oh, Mom," Vanessa said, rising from her seat napkin in hand. "You look so lovely. We weren't sure if you'd come." "I was curious," Margaret replied, simply taking her seat. The table was dressed in cream linen and silver flatware. A roast sat in the center, fresh salad, butter rolls, red wine breathing in large glasses. Daniel poured with a flourish, a toast to second chances and new beginnings. Margaret lifted her glass but didn't sip. Across from her sat a neighbour, Mrs. Elaine, from 2 doors down. She had always brought over lemon bars when Margaret was ill. Tonight she smiled politely, confused, but cordial, unaware of the undercurrents. Vanessa folded her napkin with care. "You gave us such a scare, Mum, just disappearing like that. We told everyone you'd gone to a retreat. We didn't want anyone to worry." Margaret looked at her plate, then back at Vanessa. "Kind of you." Daniel chuckled softly. "And practical too. We weren't sure when you'd be back, so we just kept things running. House maintenance bills, sorting mail." Vanessa nodded. "And just so you know, we've kept the fridge stocked. We even dusted your bookshelves. Your old tea set's still in the cupboard." Margaret reached into her handbag and drew out a neatly folded page, slightly yellowed, typed and annotated in curling cursive. She placed it next to her plate, then slowly slid it toward the center of the table. The heading was unmistakable, Journal of Abigail Moore. The page opened to a dated entry one Margaret had read again and again. "They left me. But I remembered. I wrote it all down." Vanessa's smile twitched. Her hand clenched the napkin tighter. Margaret lifted her teacup, white porcelain rose stamped. It had once been her mother's. She balanced it with grace, letting the memory of 100 quiet mornings settle into the silence. Daniel reached for his wine, but stopped halfway. Margaret smiled. "Do you remember the day you borrowed my name?" Nobody moved. Elaine glanced between them, lips parted, but she said nothing. The roast cooled on its platter. Margaret sipped her tea. The porcelain clicked softly as she set it down. Outside, wind danced through bare branches. Vanessa tightened her grip on the napkin. Daniel lowered his wineglass. No one said a word. "It's clever. If you want someone silent, just declare they don't make sense anymore." The air in Gaines's office smelled of cedar and printer ink. Snow tapped at the window, like a polite guest waiting to be acknowledged. Margaret sat in the leather armchair, hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. Gaines adjusted his glasses, laid a file down on the polished desk, and looked at her. "It arrived this morning. Emergency petition, filed by Vanessa and Daniel Whitaker." He opened the folder slowly, as if unwilling to burden her too quickly. Lena, sitting beside Margaret, clenched her jaw. "Let me guess. Mental incompetence." Gaines gave a slow nod. "They're requesting full guardianship, claiming diminished capacity based on erratic behavior. Notes from a private psychiatrist included." He slid over a page. Margaret read the highlighted line. "Subject frequently speaks to imaginary figures, including the deceased. Exhibits magical thinking, such as attributing memory to weather phenomena, likely early-stage dementia." Lena scoffed. Because she talks about snow and memory, they're quoting her journal like it's a medical report. Gaines's tone was careful. They also cited the journal's content phrases like, "I hear Abigail at night," and "the cabin still breathes." They say it's evidence of delusion. Margaret remained silent. Another page, another line. "Daniel's supplemental affidavit, Margaret, has expressed belief that inanimate objects speak to her." She placed undue trust in strangers and displayed paranoia about her own family. We are simply fulfilling our duty under the power of attorney she signed in 2021. That signature was forged, Lena said, fists tight. We have proof. But unless we respond, Gaines said a judge may grant them emergency guardianship within 24 hours. You could lose your right to make legal decisions, including decisions about where you live, who you see. Margaret traced the edge of the journal in her lap with one finger. Lena leaned forward. We can fight this. I'll testify. Fred will too. And the paper trail. Margaret lifted her hand gently. Lena. She turned to Gaines. What if I didn't speak silence? I've been called fragile, irrational, outdated. I've been dismissed with a smile more times than I can count. But there's one voice they can't dismiss. She reached into her coat pocket. Slowly, reverently, she drew out a small cassette recorder, silver scuffed with the initials AM scratched on the back. Gaines raised an eyebrow. What is that? Margaret pressed play. A woman's voice crackled into life. Tired but clear. Calm. Older but firm. My name is Abigail Moore. If you're hearing this, then I've been erased by people I once trusted. They said I forgot. But I remember everything. Lena gasped. Gaines leaned in. They told me my mind was soft, that I was unfit to decide. But I left behind this, my words, my truth, the only thing they couldn't forge. Margaret closed her eyes. Let someone else speak, she had said, and now Abigail would. She pulled from her coat pocket the final recording of Abigail, one no one had ever heard before. I was silenced once, but I recorded everything, hoping my voice would find someone brave enough to use it. The small meeting room buzzed with the hum of an old projector fan. A pale January light filtered through the frosted windows, outlining dust motes like floating ghosts. Margaret sat at the end of the narrow table, flanked by Lena and Gaines. Across from them, 3 staff members from the Elder Protection Alliance prepared files, legal forms, and a stack of exhibits to be entered as evidence. On the table sat the recorder. Margaret placed a gentle hand on it. Ready when you are, said Gaines, already flipping to a marked page in his binder. Lena nodded. Margaret pressed play. The tape clicked. Then a voice emerged, cracked old, but steady. My name is Abigail Moore. I was born in 1942 in a farmhouse in Flathead County. I raised my daughter alone. I trusted her. The room stilled. In 2018, she came to me with forms. She said they were just updates to the will, nothing serious. It's for tax purposes, Mama, she said. But I remember her hands shaking. Lena stared down, lips trembling. She brought a man? Daniel Colburn. Her advisor, she said. I wasn't told he was her husband. Not until later. Gaines made a note, his pen silent on the legal pad. I signed papers I couldn't read. Eyes were going. But I signed. Because I believed her. The voice paused, a breath fragile as frost on glass. Then the phone stopped ringing. My pension account vanished. My name was gone from the house deed. I tried to file a complaint. They said I was confused. Margaret leaned forward, eyes locked on the recorder. I knew I wasn't crazy, but no one listened. The recording crackled slightly, then resumed. If you're hearing this and your name is Margaret Whitaker, I want you to know Vanessa Colburn signed contracts under my name. She forged documents. Daniel was always just out of reach of being blamed. He knew where the loopholes were. One of the staff members sat back in his chair, visibly shaken. I tried to sue. The case was dismissed, said I had no proof that I seemed forgetful in the deposition. I was sick. I couldn't finish what I started. Lena covered her mouth. I left this tape in case someone else, someone like me, needed it. Because when you lose everything, sometimes all you have is your story. A pause. A long one. Then, tell Margaret I remember her. She's not crazy. She's not broken. And she deserves to be heard. Click. Silence reclaimed the room. For several seconds, no one moved. Then Gaines rose to his feet. I'll prepare the motion to introduce this as evidence. Margaret looked down at the recorder, her voice barely above a whisper. She gave me back my voice. Gaines lifted his briefcase. Let's go to court. Gaines stood up. Let's go to court. They counted on my silence. But they never counted on my memory. The courthouse smelled faintly of wet wool and old wood polish. Outside, the January chill pressed its knuckles against the glass, but inside the warmth came only from overhead fluorescent lights. The waiting area buzzed with murmurs and the occasional cough. Margaret sat straight on the bench, a soft navy scarf around her neck, the same one she'd worn every winter since her husband passed. Across the aisle sat Vanessa and Daniel. Vanessa glanced at Margaret occasionally, quick, skittering looks that never landed for long. Daniel, pale and rigid, thumbed through a folder with the rehearsed calm of someone who believed paperwork could mask intent. The courtroom doors opened. All rise. Judge Ward stepped in, robed in black eyes unreadable beneath silver-rimmed glasses. The hearing began. Vanessa stood first. Your Honor, my mother suffered a stroke 2 years ago. She's shown increased emotional instability and confusion, often speaking to people who aren't there. We believe she needs protection. We only want what's best. Daniel added smoothly. We've been managing her finances since 2021, with a durable power of attorney signed in good faith. Gaines stood without looking at them. We'd like to submit the following into evidence: a forged power of attorney, a scanned will that bears no notarization, and a sworn affidavit from Mr. Fred McAllister, who retained the original 2019 will signed and witnessed properly. Judge Ward raised an eyebrow. Original Gaines handed over the folder. The handwriting matches Margaret's, but this scan Daniel submitted. The loops are inconsistent, and it lacks any witness. Not even a notary seal. Vanessa's lips parted, but no sound came out. And that's not all, Gaines continued. He nodded to the technician. The room dimmed slightly as a speaker hissed to life. Then Abigail's voice echoed through the courtroom, stronger now in this sterile place of judgment. My name is Abigail Moore. If you're hearing this, Vanessa Colburn signed contracts under my name. She forged documents. Daniel was always just out of reach of being blamed. He knew where the loopholes were. Vanessa visibly tensed. Daniel's hands gripped the arms of his chair. Tell Margaret I remember her. She's not crazy. She's not broken. And she deserves to be heard. Silence. The judge leaned forward. Mrs. Whitaker, he said, do you understand what's happening today? Margaret stood. The room, the air, the entire space stilled around her. Yes, she said, voice steady. I remember everything. That's the difference between them and me. A beat passed, then another. Judge Ward looked at the paperwork, at Vanessa, at Daniel, and then back at Margaret. This court suspends the temporary guardianship order effective immediately, he said. Further, I am referring this matter to the district attorney for investigation into potential fraud and financial abuse. Vanessa's face drained of colour. Daniel whispered something under his breath, but Margaret didn't look at them. She turned to Gaines and simply nodded. She had been heard. The judge issued an immediate suspension of all temporary guardianship and ordered an investigation into Vanessa and Daniel for financial misconduct. I didn't win. I simply returned to where I belong. The afternoon sun slid lazily through the sheer curtains, painting soft gold across the hardwood floor. The kitchen smelled faintly of old spice and fresh beginnings. Margaret stood in the doorway, her hand resting lightly on the frame, as if asking permission to enter her own life again. There was no fanfare, no declaration, only breath and wood and memory. She stepped inside. The air carried the faint scent of lavender detergent, and something deeper herself, perhaps layered into the walls by years of tea-quiet conversations and pages turned at the kitchen table. The chair by the window waited. So did the kettle. Margaret moved gently as though not to startle the stillness. She placed the linen scarf, her husband's now hers for many winters, back onto the chair. Then she reached into a drawer and retrieved the old porcelain teacup, the one with the faint blue rim worn from time. Behind her, Lena entered quietly, holding a stack of documents. She set them on the table, glancing around with reverence. "It feels unchanged," Lena whispered. Margaret shook her head. "No, it's exactly what changed that makes it feel right again." They unpacked papers in silence, sorting what remained from what had been twisted. Between them, they discovered a small envelope tucked between pages, worn at the edges, sealed in wax that had long since cracked. Lena read the handwriting aloud. From Abigail. Inside was a folded letter, yellowed and trembling at the creases. Margaret opened it with care. "If someone reads this, remember quiet voices still carry weight. Not every fight is loud, but every truth wants to be heard. If you find my name, let yours be strong beside it." Margaret pressed the paper to her heart, then slid it into a fresh folder marked simply Voices. From the corner window, the afternoon light shifted. Fred's familiar knock came next. He stepped in, holding a small pie wrapped in foil. "Brought apple. Thought you might want something warm." Margaret smiled, nodded toward the table. Fred sat, not saying much, just breathing the same air as her with a kind of unspoken approval. The kettle whistled. She poured 3 cups, no questions, no roles to assign, just people surviving. Margaret sat, opened a blank notebook, and wrote the first line without hesitation. "This isn't a revenge story. It's a remembering story." She looked at Lena, then at Fred, then toward the window. Outside, snow had softened into mist, a quiet thaw. Fred shifted in his chair and asked, barely above a whisper, "What are you going to do now, Margaret?" She stared out the window, her hand resting on the cup, her scarf curled beside her like memory warmed. "Let others be heard." Fred asked gently, "What are you going to do now, Margaret?" She looked out the window and replied, "Let others be heard. No one speaks loudly here. But everyone is finally heard." The room smelled of lemon polish and old paper. Light slanted in from the tall window panes, catching specks of dust that floated like time. It was a small corner room, tucked at the back of the town's public library, once used for storing outdated encyclopedias. Now it had become something else, a sanctuary not for facts, but for truths. Margaret placed the last teacup on the wooden tray, her movements slow but sure. Lena stood at the doorway, affixing the hand-painted sign above the frame, "The Archive of Quiet Voices, where memory is testimony." She stepped back, eyes glistening just a bit. "It's official now," Lena whispered. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She looked around the room instead. A single round table in the center. 2 chairs facing each other. A small shelf with blank notebooks, recording devices, and a basket of soft wool shawls. And the kettle, of course, always humming low like a patient witness. By mid-morning, the first guests arrived. Mrs. Doreen Tate, 83, leaned on a walker with tennis balls duct-taped to the feet. Her granddaughter accompanied her, a lanky teenager in a hoodie, face flushed from embarrassment or cold, it was hard to tell. Lena guided them in gently. "Would you like some tea?" Margaret asked. Doreen smiled, her lipstick faded, but her dignity intact. Only if it's hot. They settled in. Margaret turned on the small recording device and nodded. Doreen's voice, though raspy, carried like a hush that refused to be ignored. My son used my name to borrow money. Credit cards. Car loan. Didn't tell me until the collectors called. Said it was a mistake, said he'd fix it. He never did. She took a breath. I paid off a debt I never made because I didn't want to see him go to jail. But I never saw him again after that. He stopped visiting. The silence after was warm, not empty. Margaret reached across the table and touched Doreen's hand. No judgment. Just listening. More visitors followed. A man named Elias with deep-set eyes and a voice like crushed velvet spoke of being convinced to sell the house he'd built with his late wife. They said it was too much upkeep for someone like me, he said. Someone like me. As if grief makes you incapable. Later, Margaret read aloud for the first time from her own account. She chose the passage written the day after the snow, the one she wrote from inside the cabin wrapped in Abigail's words like armor. They left me in the cold. But the silence didn't swallow me. I wrote. I remembered. That made me real again. Lena looked up from her notes. The teenager by the door wasn't on her phone anymore. She was watching, listening. Something shifted. By late afternoon, the light had dimmed into a soft amber wash across the wooden floor. The tea had grown cold in most of the cups, but no one moved to leave. Margaret and Lena sat with two more elders, now Mr. Harold Lyman and Mrs. Bernice Coe. They had come quietly, hands tucked inside coats too large for their frames, but their eyes held decades. Margaret offered them the chance to write, if speaking felt too raw. Bernice declined gently. No, I'll say it. I never told my daughter how I truly felt. She calls once a week and tells me about yoga and oat milk, and I nod. But I wish she'd ask me what it's like to eat alone for 12 years. Margaret didn't interrupt. No one did. From the corner shelf, Lena brought a small folder marked Collected Memories. Each page was a handwritten story, a fragment, a confession. They were short. None longer than 2 paragraphs. But each one pulsed with what Margaret now understood to be quiet power, not silence, but restrained survival. Then came the moment Margaret had prepared for but never expected to feel so deeply. An older gentleman entered hat in hand, nervous to his bones. His coat was neatly buttoned shoes, polished, but he trembled slightly as he approached the table. "May I?" he asked. Lena smiled, offering him the chair. "Would you like someone to sit with you?" "No," he said. "I think I need to say this by myself." He sat. Margaret pressed the red button on the recorder and slid it closer. He leaned in his voice, barely a whisper. "I'm not sure anyone will care, but here it is." A pause, and then my son took everything, not with force, but with kindness. He told me he'd take care of the boring parts. Bank accounts, bills. He said I could just rest, and I did. Until I didn't recognize the house I was in anymore. He stopped, wiped his brow with a crumpled handkerchief. "I'm not angry. I just wanted someone to know I was here. I'm still here." The room did not respond with applause. It didn't need to. It responded with silence, strong, respectful silence. The kind Margaret had once feared, now redefined. Later, when most had gone, and dusk had swallowed the town in early January, dark, Lena brought over the first printed collection of stories. A simple cover, off-white paper, black letters, unadorned. Collected Memories. Volume 1. Margaret turned it over in her hands, feeling its modest weight. She smiled, not proudly, but as someone who has finally found the temperature of her own name again. Lena asked, "Should we add numbers to the next ones?" Volume 2-3. Margaret shook her head firm and soft all at once. Let's not number them. Let's just call them still here. This year no one left me in the snow, but someone left me a cake. The window of the archive room caught the morning light just right. It pooled on the long wooden table like a quiet celebration. Outside, January pressed against the glass, soft and cold, but inside the room held warmth like a remembered name. Fred arrived first. He didn't say happy birthday. He never did things loudly, but he set down a foil-covered dish and gave Margaret a small, knowing nod. Apple, he said. Extra cinnamon. Margaret smiled, the kind that begins more in the chest than the face. She placed the pie gently on the sideboard and lit the kettle. A small ritual, now one that said, "We are still here." Lena followed soon after, carrying a single candle tucked into her coat pocket. She struck a match and set the flame into a small sponge cake from the corner bakery. 71, she whispered. Not that it matters, but I thought, you should have at least one candle. Margaret nodded and closed her eyes for just a moment, not to make a wish, but to take inventory. 1 year ago, she had sat in silence with a mug of tea gone cold and a promise from her daughter that never intended to keep her warm. Today, there was no promise. But there was presence, and that she'd come to learn was worth more. They didn't sing. They didn't clap. They just passed the tea and sat in a circle as the archive room filled with low, murmured voices and the sound of a cake being cut. Then the door opened. A young woman stepped in, hesitating at the threshold. In her hands, she held a photograph, creased and faded edges worn like worry. "Hi," she said softly. "I'm sorry to interrupt. I was told this is where people share stories." Margaret stood smoothing her skirt. "It is." The girl lifted the photo. "This was my grandmother. She used to write all the time, pages and pages, but no one ever saved them. They're gone now. I wondered if I could still read something of hers, or maybe say something here, for her." There was no committee, no formal permission. Margaret simply crossed the room, opened the cabinet drawer, and pulled out a blank notebook bound in soft leather, the same kind Abigail had once filled with truth, too long, silenced. She handed it to the girl. "Start here," she said. "There's always room for one more voice. No speeches, no applause. Just the sound of tea being poured again, a chair sliding back, and someone clicking on the small recorder in the corner." Margaret sat by the window, the flame of the birthday candle still trembling, not yet burned down. She opened her newest journal and turned to the final page she had saved for today. Slowly, with the pen Lena had given her months ago, she wrote, "I remember. I survived. But most of all, I remained." Across the room, the young woman took a shaky breath and pressed the red button. Her voice, though soft, carried like something long buried finally choosing to bloom. "This story isn't mine, but I'm here to carry it. They thought she would vanish, swallowed by snow memory and silence, but she returned not with rage, but with receipts, resilience, and the quiet power of remembrance. Justice may arrive late, but when it does, it walks in with names, dates, and pages that never burned. No wall of lies can stand forever against the tide of truth." Have you ever been told you were just imagining things? Tell your story below. Let it be heard. Comment to share. Like if it moved you. Follow Grandma Stories 96, where quiet voices echo the loudest.